Hi, I'm Sharaad Kuttan. Welcome to Let's Talk, the show that tries to bring you some of the most important conversations of the day. Now, the Middle East is often on our screens as a flashpoint, tensions between different communities and over geopolitical interests. To help us get more depth into a region that's actually much more complex and often portrayed, I have with me Professor Dietrich Jung. He's at the Center of Contemporary Middle East Studies at the University of Southern Denmark. Thank you so much, Dietrich, for being with me.
Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, it's a tough one, it's a big subject, but can we start with you, a European, a German, interested in Islamic studies and in particular the region of the Middle East. Tell us, how did you get into it?
There are two reasons behind that. The one is that I was politically socialized in the late 1970s. And for a German in particular, a young German who was politically interested, there were two solidarities competing. Solidarity with the Israeli state, because of the Holocaust and the background of German historical legacy. And on the other hand, there were the Palestinians. And this was very puzzling and raised my interest into the region. And the other thing was, when I came close to 20, I just wanted to leave Europe, and I had not so much money, so the only thing what was to do was crossing the Mediterranean.
Right, and it's interesting that you say it's as simple as crossing the Mediterranean. Europe seems so opposed to the Middle East in terms of its values, at least some would suggest. But in geographical terms, very, very close to each other, and of course historically deeply entwined with each other. Did that history of the relationship between Christian Europe and the Muslim world play a part in your education? Was that apparent in what you were seeing growing up?
Not really, no. I did not see the two regions in terms of a religious opposition or at all in religious terms. That I can do in retrospect and what I have learned. And when you mention that there are two regions and the Mediterranean in between, what I have never learned at school really was that the Ottoman Empire was already a European player as well, not just a Middle Eastern player. And this is something we tend to forget in our historical education. But I did not see that when I became engaged in the region. That is something I know now.
Okay, so what was the route that you took? Is it as a sociologist, as a historian, as a political scientist? What was your choice to enter into the Middle East?
The choice was, I was interested in politics, so I studied political science. And the other thing was, I have been to Egypt, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and I did not speak the language. So I was interested in Arabic, I wanted to study Arabic, and I had to discover that the almost only way at that time in the 1980s was to study Islamic Studies, where Arabic was a tool. It was not the main purpose. So, and in this way I came also to Islam, but it was not at my highest priority on my agenda what I wanted to learn. So it was Arabic plus political science, and the studies became political science and Islamic studies.
Interesting, Islamic studies, we would think of the 50s, 60s and 70s of the Middle East. It's often dominated by secular parties, the Ba'athist Party, of leftist regimes. We have Yemen, to all kinds of other leftist regimes. This shift from the secular Arab, the image of the secular Arab to a kind of a more religious one, was that something that you grappled with? I mean, how did you kind of negotiate that?
Well, when you start to learn Arabic and you understand the language, and then you will also understand that this kind of juxtaposing the secular regimes of the 50s, 60s and Islam today is a bit flawed. Already somebody like Nasser, who is known as an Arab socialist, also used religious terms in his political language. So in this sense, one should be careful to see these two political, as political camps. They are antagonists. But when you look at the political language of the region, there was always a sort of religious terms which have been used because they resonate amongst broader parts of the population.
Right, so if, as a political scientist watching political behavior or political formations and organizations, you still had to understand the religious idioms in which politics was cast. Is that what you're saying?
As long as you really listened. Look, when you are a politician in the Arab world, and later I was also working in Turkey, in Turkey you speak with two audiences. The one is your home audience, and the other one is the international audience. And you speak two languages. And not just literally two languages, but also in terms of meaning. So a speech in English by an Arab president is different than the speech in Arabic. And in Arabic it's much more usual that you use language which you can associate to Islam.
Right. So you had to become, as a scholar, more attentive to these nuances, these different registers.
That you naturally, yeah.
What were you looking at when you started? What specific elements of Middle Eastern society, cultural politics were you interested in?
I started out with what also the media like to present, that's wars and conflicts. And I have done also in political science war and conflict studies, so it was almost natural that I was looking at conflicts. I wrote my MA thesis on the civil war in Lebanon, for example, and the focus was on conflict in the region.
Now, you know, when we talk about, especially the Muslim world, today there are equivalents made, false equivalents, people say, between Islam and terrorism and that kind of politics. You said you came out of the 70s, where actually the left was in fact the harbinger of violent extremism. We had the Red Army factions in Germany and many parts of Europe. Were you surprised, I mean, seeing this long arc of the transformation of the image of the Muslim, of Muslim politics, at least from a European standpoint?
I would say the interesting thing is that more global ideas frame also the way we see conflicts. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict never was an East-West conflict in terms of the Cold War, but it has been perceived in that way, and certainly the Soviet Union and the United States were on different camps and have supported different forces. Today, East and West is Islam and the West, because the global framing has changed. Many of the conflicts on the ground, in my opinion, are still the same social conflicts, but the way they are perceived and the way also they are expressed by local forces has changed.
Could that have been anticipated? Did anybody anticipate this shift in framing, as you put it?
This is difficult to answer. I have not a straightforward answer to that. But what I think is wrong, or what I do not like so much, is this complete idea of an Islamic revival. Because if we look at the history of colonialism in the region and the history of states getting independent, then Islam always was a force in this political struggle, right from the 19th century.
Like an anti-imperialist force.
Yes, the first pan-Islamic anti-imperialist ideas are from Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani from the second half of the 19th century, where a pan-Islamic movement should oppose British colonialism. So in this sense, this is not utterly new, that there is an idea of global Islamic Ummah which should go against political suppression. We had that before.
Okay, and in the final minute we have, I mean, were your next steps? I mean, was it a very straight path for you in terms of your subject matter, or did you have serendipitous moments which took you in different directions?
I had to earn money, so very often the decision was made according to what my superiors would like to do in terms of research, so there was no straight path, but there was certainly a continuation in my own way of career, what I have been interested into. And I was following basically somehow a bit the trend, because I was moving more from Middle Eastern conflicts to the modern history of Islam.
Right, okay. We'll take a short break. We'll be back with more. Stay tuned to Let's Talk. Welcome back to Let's Talk. I'm Sharaad Kuttan. With me, Dietrich Jung. He's a professor at the Center of Contemporary Middle East Studies at the University of Southern Denmark. His current project is something titled the Modern Muslim Subjectivities Project. Dietrich, help us understand, what does it mean to talk about modern subjectivities?
You know, the origin of this project is my interest in sociology. And in the way in the 20th century people, and I use the term, had to construct themselves, that we call identity building. When you look at the sociological literature, I would say 90% is dealing with Western Europe and the United States. And there are developed sociological concepts, you can say ideal types of what makes a modern subject. But they are not made in reference to other parts of the world. And because of having been living in many different Islamic countries or Muslim countries, I could see these types amongst Muslims as well. So my interest was to see how more widespread global types of identity or of identification are linked to Islamic traditions, how Muslims have been engaged in doing that. And that was the origin of the study, and dissatisfaction with concepts that are basically loaned by European history and not really reflect upon histories of other people.
Right, so not necessarily grounded in those particular contexts. I do want to ask you, just to get some conceptual clarity, what is not modern then? I mean, if there's modern subjects and subjectivities, what is pre-modern, non-modern? How would you describe that?
With respect to this project and the term of a subject, the non-modern is not a subject, in the sense of that it is you who have to build up, to construct yourself. And that's a particularly modern thing to do. You are born into the world as what you are in pre-modern times. In modern times, you are continuously working on yourself. Right, and that's a difficult concept to grapple with, because I think a lot of us assume that intuitively we are born into cultures, that we are Indian, at least in the Malaysian context, Indian, Malay, Chinese, or whatever subdivisions of that may be, that it's not a thought-out process, it's not something that we consciously do. But you're saying that actually the modern subject does that. And maybe to illustrate, how do they do that? Now, one point is, I'm speaking as an observer. And observers very often analyze and identify things actors themselves do unconsciously. This is in particular something in psychology, sociology, academics do. So therefore it's not very surprising and not an argument against this self-formation that you are not doing it consciously. But you say you have a Malayan background as culture. You might be raised as a Muslim, but you're also a clerk for the state administration, and you had an education at higher education institutes. You are a father. You are the father of a soccer-playing boy. So there are different subject positions which you permanently have to negotiate. And that is your daily task in modern life. And this actually never ends. It is a continuous process. Now, a lot of talk, and I think it comes from leaders, that suggest that our identities are pretty much fixed, and they don't have the fluidity that you suggest, so they don't have the dynamics of a constant building or repairing or shoring up or maybe even changing. What specific identities or groups of people, demographic groups, were you looking at in terms of looking at this issue of subjectivities? Now, what we can in very broad terms say is that throughout the 20th century you have a change in terms of identification with the collective, rather moving to a kind of more individualized self-making process. If you think, and we have, for example, also worked with the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood, founded in 1928. The global Ikhwan?
Ikhwan Muslimin?
Yeah, Ikhwan al-Muslimin. And there you can see certainly founded in the 1920s, they had a very strong peer group oriented collectivist identity orientation. This does not anymore fit, and also in many Muslim settings today. So in this sense, you have a shift of specific types you are oriented toward when you construct yourself. And these have their conjunctures over history. So in this sense, you can detect relevant and globally visible forms of the subject, but it's always tied to local traditions and everyday experiences.
What about the question of a global culture? And I think it's specifically of, looking in the Malaysian context, of young people. I always think of young people. This is where I would concede that it is very fluid, that young people seem to be so responsive to all kinds of inputs, not just local but global, things that they watch on television, on Netflix. Consumer lifestyle seems to be shaping their identities. Is that something that the Muslim world, as you observe it, is also grappling with, this idea of the globalized subject who's constantly consuming things?
Definitely. Otherwise, Muslims would not be a part of the global life, and they are indeed. So the question in itself, I think, makes no sense. We have to. What is important is to see that we do not have a culture in terms of containers. What we do have are very different levels of culture, and even if you do not think that you are linked to something like global templates of culture, you are in your everyday life. And as you rightly say, with technological advancement, this individual identity construction more and more rely on almost accidental access to specific kind of media and specific. You get today teachers, whether in religion, in culture, whether in politics or in medicine, via Google.
Right. I want to ask you, so when you're looking at these, do you have to frame it in national terms? Are you looking, say for instance, as women of Lebanon or the young people of Tunisia? I mean, is this how it operates when you need to be, when you do your observational work?
I think we should not disregard the national context. And the national context plays a role in particular when you have, if we take this example of the so-called Arab Spring, the rebellion 2011, 2012. There one concern certainly was to change national governments. So you cannot avoid to act and to view politics within the context of the national state. However, you do that possibly in relating to more general global values and norms like human rights, like labor rights, where you get ideas from more developed welfare states. So it's a permanent juggling with levels and negotiating with your aims what you are targeting. But we should not underestimate that the national government and the confines of the national state are quite imperative in terms of political action.
Very quickly, what are the countries in the Middle East that you observe more closely, that you comment on?
Well, I have been, I started my career with looking closer to Egypt, Lebanon, and later I studied Arabic in Syria. Then I had the guest professorship in Turkey, and I turned into a Turkey expert. So in the past decade, I worked more on Turkey than on Arab countries.
Okay, we'll return in a short while. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Let's Talk. I'm Sharaad. With me, Dietrich Jung. professor at the Center for Contemporary Middle East Studies at the University of Southern Denmark. You ended by talking about looking at, Turkey as a country, but also, of course, there's a huge Turkish population in Germany where you originate from, and all kinds of media shape our views of, including a brilliant show I watched recently called The Dogs of Berlin. But we felt going into a kind of a cinematic critique there. I want to ask you about the ways in which the media teaches people, Muslims and non-Muslims alike, to view the Muslim world. And what do you think is going on there? What are the pitfalls in the way that media might, or ways that media is in fact helping understanding deepen about the Muslim world, or at least the Middle East?
I think we have to look at 2 points. The first one is that media are not interested in ordinary life normally. And therefore, I think radical Islamist groups get more attention than they probably should. However, they are a concern, and this we cannot disregard. But it's clear when you speak about, and nobody can give you the precise number of people with Turkish background in Germany, we speak about millions of people who conduct very, very ordinary lives. And this is not news. And the other thing is that we should certainly identify, meanwhile, people with a Turkish background as Muslims. But you should not underestimate, nobody was talking about Muslims then the parents or the grandparents of these people came to Europe. They were Turks. We did not even know whether Turks could be Kurds or Yazidis or Alevi. So all this kind of differentiation did not exist. And I think that most of the Turkish population who came at that time also did not poster themselves in different ethnic or religious categories. So we are meanwhile in a period of time in which, interestingly enough, religion becomes a much more important identity marker.
Which is not the expectation, right? I mean, in the 70s, the expectation was, in fact, of religion disappearing as countries or societies became more modern.
But this was certainly a historical narrative which was hegemonic, which was dominant, that modernization goes along with the disappearance of religion. There are not many sociologists who would still claim that, and it has never ever described actually also the history of Europe. You will always have had minorities who tried to live a Catholic modern life or a deeply Protestant modern life. So in this sense, certainly, and from the beginning of the 20th century, promoted by a specific intellectual elite, the idea of a religious, free or non-religious world was a hegemonic idea. But it was not, let's say, a representation of all the facets of life that happened in Europe.
And I'm going to ask you a very difficult question and give you exactly 2 minutes to answer it, which is, if we were concerned to deepen our understanding of the Middle East, comes to us through television, what should we be attentive to? You say the media is not interested in ordinary life, so we're always presented with conflict. How do we get past that? Or how do we get to something other than what is presented to us?
We have to, I think, look at 2 things. The one thing is, and that I learned when living in the Middle East, interested in conflict, I saw that there are still nice, ordinary people living their daily lives, and I have been living together with them. And we should not forget that the Middle East is much more than conflict and war. It's culture, it's religion, it's habits of ordinary people, it's hard work. So this is something we should not forget. And the other thing is, we should not, on the one hand, make this kind of holistic idea that this region is a unity. It's very diverse, and it always had very strong connections to Europe. Also, Europe and the Middle East are not antagonists. They're interlacing.
Okay, thank you so much. I've been speaking to Professor Dietrich Jung, professor of the at the Center for Contemporary Middle East Studies at the University of Southern Denmark. We've been talking about the world in conflict and our relationship to that, and how we might deepen or change or rethink our relationship to what we see on our television screens. Thank you so much for joining me on Let's Talk. I'm Sharaad Kuttan, only for Astro AWANI. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.